Hello, and today's learning target is I can solve more complicated absolute value inequalities. Let's look at the statement. Remember, when solving absolute value inequalities, we must split into two inequalities and flip the inequality and the sign on the number. So let's fill in those blanks. When solving absolute value inequalities, split into two inequalities and flip the inequality and the sign on the number. So today, what we're going to look at is what's new. Only split the inequality when it has been isolated. So let's look at a review from what we've already known, or what we already know about absolute value inequalities. Solve and graph the following inequalities. So the absolute value of 10 plus 4x is less than 14. We'll split this up into two cases, and I'll color code it. So the first case will be in blue, and that's as we see it. So 10 plus 4x is less than 14. And then the second case is 10 plus 4x is greater than negative 14. So let's go ahead and solve those. So what I'll do is I'll subtract 10 here and get 4x is less than 4. Divide both sides by 4 and get x is less than 1. Now if I solve the other side here, I'll subtract 10, get 4x is greater than negative 24, divide by 4, and get x is greater than negative 6. So now I'll go ahead and graph the solution of those two, and I can put some numbers on my number line. And I'll have an open circle at 1 and an open circle at negative 6, and then there'll be an overlap there, so this would be an and statement, and that would be my final graph. All right, let's look at the second example. So the absolute value of negative 9v is less than or equal to 54. So I'll write my two cases. The first one is as I see it. And the second case, I must flip the inequality sign, change the value on the other side, and I'll divide by a negative 9. And when I divide by a negative, I have to flip the inequality symbol. Same thing on this side. So I get v is greater than or equal to negative 6, and v is less than or equal to positive 6. So I'm just going to place a few numbers on my number line, so I don't have to number all of those values. I would have a closed circle at negative 6, closed circle at positive 6, and shade in between, so this would also be an and statement. All right, let's move on to a few of the other examples. So let's solve and graph the following inequalities. I'm going to zoom in here. And so these are new that we're going to practice isolating the variable first, or isolating the absolute value, I should say, and then writing our two cases. So what I need to do on this first inequality before I can write my two inequalities, two statements, is I need to get rid of this division of 5. So I'm going to multiply by 5 and get the absolute value of x minus 4 is less than or equal to 10. Now I'm going to go ahead and split that up into two cases. The first case is as I see it, and the second case is I flipped the inequality and changed the sign. So nothing too new there, but we first had to isolate our absolute value before we could write our two inequality statements. So I'll add 4 and get x is less than or equal to 14. And over here I'll add 4 and get x is greater than or equal to negative 6. And then I'll go ahead and I will write my inequality, or get my graph. And I'll number this, just put a few values on my number line here. And I'll just place a few. And then I want everything less than or equal to 14, or greater than or equal to negative 6. So that would be an overlap, so this would be an and statement. All right, let's move on to the next example. So again, I have to isolate the absolute value first. And I will go ahead and add 3, and then get the absolute value of n minus 2 is greater than 8. Now I can go ahead and write my two inequality statements. The first case is as we see it, so n minus 2 is greater than 8. And the second case is n minus 2 is less than negative 8. So we'll go ahead and solve these inequalities, and I'll add 2 and get n is greater than 10. And then add 2 over here and get n is less than negative 6. Go ahead and graph this on my number line, and I'll just put a few points in here. So we'll go, negative 6, we'll count by 2's. And I have an open circle at negative 6, shading everything to the left of that. Open circle at 10, shading to the right of that. So this would be an OR statement, right? Because in that graph, I have a gap in the graph. All right, let's look at our next example. Again, before we can write our two cases, we have to isolate the absolute value. So I will I'll subtract 8 first. And I'll get 4 times the absolute value of 6 minus 2a is less than or equal to 24 minus 8 is 16. Then, since I have 4 being multiplied by the absolute value here, I'll go ahead and divide by 4 to get rid of that. And then what I'm left with is the absolute value of 6 minus 2n is less than or equal to 4. Now I can go ahead and write my two cases. So the first case will be as I see it, 6 minus 2n is less than or equal to 4. And the second case will be 6 minus 2n is greater than or equal to negative 4. And I'll go ahead and solve these two inequalities. And now I'll go ahead and solve these inequalities. And I'll subtract 6 first. And get negative 2n is less than or equal to negative 2. Divide by a negative 2. And then I will have to flip the inequality because I divided by a negative, and get n is, or this should be a. I don't know how I put n. Let's change that back to an a. I don't know how I got n there. Well, anyway, so I'll erase this and get a, right? This should be an a is greater than or equal to, and actually I divided by a negative 2, so it should be a positive 1. So we'll change that right there to a positive 1. And then over here, I'll subtract 6. Get negative 2a is greater than or equal to negative 10. Divide by a negative 2. And get a is less than or equal to 5. And now I'll go ahead and graph. Whoops, that was not the pen. And I will go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a closed circle at 1 and a closed circle at 5, and then this would be an overlap, so this would be an and statement. That would be the answer to this example. Now let's look at our next example. So I'm going to isolate the absolute value by adding 6 and get the absolute value of v plus 5 is less than 1. And now I'll go ahead and write my two statements. So v plus 5 is less than 1 and v plus 5 is greater than negative 1. And I'll make sure I got the right variable. I do. So now I'll subtract 5. V is less than negative 4. And then I'll subtract 5 over here. V is greater than negative 6. And then I'll go ahead and make my graph at negative 6. And then I'll have a open circle at negative 4, open circle at 6, and this will also be an overlap. Therefore, it would be put that right there. That looks better. That would be an and statement. So this would be the answer to this example. Again, that would be an and statement. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.